Hello and welcome to the CX Files for June 20th, 2024. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm back home in Sao Paulo now.
And I'm Peter Ryan, back home in Montreal, Quebec. Mark, great to see you, or great to hear you in the case of the podcast. And really nice to be able to catch back up. How was what were the results of your visit to the UK?
Well, primarily it was more of a family visit, but I certainly did take the opportunity to go out and meet a few people from the industry. So certainly I've been around having a few lunches and checking out some of our old friends, especially some of the people that I met in Atlanta.
That's fantastic. And did you get the opportunity to partake in any of the more cultural elements of the UK? Any pubs or any shows that might have cropped up on the horizon?
Certainly a few pubs, certainly. I mean, you can't avoid it.
Just a few.
Can't avoid it in the UK. Although I was all over the UK from Hull to Manchester to London to Weymouth in the south. So it's really been a tour around the country in 1 week.
That reminds me of the epic Only Fools and Horses episode to Hull and back. I think you might have done that, although not in a three-wheeled yellow truck.
Certainly something like that. Yeah, yeah. So why don't you introduce our guest for this week? Because I know it's one of your interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mark, this week we're catching up with Andreas Helland, who is the CEO and the co-founder of Atender Group. Now, if you've not heard of Atender Group, I would highly recommend that you take the time to check it out. This is a very unique BPO operator. Now, as it stands, the Atender Group itself is headquartered out of Norway, and specifically, it's based out of Bergen. Now, what's interesting and unique about this, though, is how the Atender Group works is they provide customer service primarily in Nordic languages out of Malaga in Spain. Now, the reality is that this might sound a little disingenuous. And why would you go to Malaga, like one of the nicest tourist destinations in all of Europe, to try and find individuals that are speaking different Nordic languages? Well, what Andreas explained to me is the fact that due to the fact that there's a good number of individuals who migrate to that part of Europe during the course of the year, it's actually relatively straightforward to find a niche number of people that have capacity in perhaps Norwegian, in Finnish, in Swedish, and Danish that are able to come and do some work perhaps on a part-time basis while they spend the rest of their time enjoying what Malaga has to offer. And, I think that this is one of the areas of BPO that I personally really like getting into the weeds around. The fact of the matter is, people think that this is a generic industry. People think that there's no innovation. This is a clear example of an entrepreneur from Norway that has taken the time to go out and do his best, along with the rest of his team, to be able to try and find a niche way of delivering into a number of different countries that have, quite frankly, challenges with regards to sourcing talent in the nearshore or the offshore. And he's making it work.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea as well. Certainly, I've seen this Nordic language support out of Greece and Portugal before, but that was a bit more formal. It was more like companies that were advertising jobs over in the Nordics and bringing
Mhm.
people over as part of a package where they relocate them as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this has been one of the challenges around the multilingual hub model. Now, by no means would I think Andreas be trying to promote their operation or Malaga as multilingual hubs. I think rather what they're saying is they're taking advantage of the fact that there is a supply of individuals that have talent when it comes to certain languages, and that they're using their organization as effectively a conduit to provide good customer service, high quality customer service to a set number of consumers that are relatively challenging to support, whether you're doing it, say, onshore, where it's quite expensive in many of the Nordic locations, versus the offshore, where, as you say, there are perhaps pockets, but those pockets are excessively challenging in terms of being able to recruit and very expensive too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we go straight to your conversation with Andreas then?
Looking forward to it. Well, the CX Files goes very European this week. And in that spirit, I couldn't be more pleased to welcome to the podcast Andreas Helland, who is the CEO and co-founder of Atender. Now, Atender is a very interesting BPO we're going to be diving into today. It's headquartered in Malaga, Spain. But Andreas, you're joining us from your home in Bergen, Norway, are you not?
Yes, I am, and thank you for having me.
Well, the pleasure is ours. And for full disclosure, you and I have caught up a number of times before as I've been conducting the research that we do at Ryan Strategic Advisory. And as we're exploring new topics for the podcast, I thought, and I explained this to my co-host Mark Hillary, that you would be an outstanding person to bring on for a chat, considering I think that you have carved out an amazing niche with your BPO in terms of the markets that you're servicing, but also the manner in which you're doing it. You know, we hear all sorts of stories about the traditional onshore, offshore, nearshore. We're hearing talk about hybrid and so forth. But I think with yourselves, with what you've been able to do um, at Atender, you have really managed to develop a business model that I think is quite unique. So, as a starting point, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about who you are, talk about how the company was founded, and maybe if we could dive in a little bit in terms of this unique approach that Attender takes to the CX services space.
Absolutely. I could definitely do that. I tend to talk a lot, so stop me if I go on for too long. But yeah, my background is I'm based in Norway, and I am Norwegian. And my background before I started out in that was actually a very different one than the traditional BPO outsourcing business. I was part of creating a tech company that worked in the video tech scene basically, and we were providing streaming solutions for media companies all across the world. Um, Now, my co-founder and I, we both had that same background, and he founded one of Norway's largest domain hosters back in the day. And the experience that we'd had doing that, creating something from scratch and scaling up these early stage tech companies in Norway, was that it was really difficult finding good customer service partners. We talked to all the traditional BPOs, and they tended to be too large for us. We were too small to be interesting. And there's also something about the cultural mindset, understanding kind of the flexibility that's needed, etc., which was just not a match. And then on the other end of the scale, we had hundreds and hundreds of these smaller, customer service companies that tended to be a bit too unprofessional, or not a fit in that sense. So our idea, early on was just, let's create a company that's perfectly suited for these young tech companies, especially out of the Nordics, and let's create a company that just understands their needs and scales together with these companies as they grow. And that's what we ended up doing. And if you look at our customer portfolio today, it's mostly Nordic companies that have some kind of software component that they provide, and we provide multilingual support teams out of our Málaga hub primarily, but also through our Bali hub and our Mexico hub as well. But the interesting thing, and I think what defined our company even more, and I think when you start a new company, it's always about finding your reason to exist, your why. And for us, when we started out, we had like the simple business idea in place, but I didn't fully have our why. Why do we exist? And it only took us, a couple of few months of being in that space and just getting the exposure, all the anecdotes, all the stories, before realizing that. And I apologize for the language here. The BPO industry in general is a bit of a shit industry, and that comes down to the human value, how people are being treated, and kind of the mindset when it comes to leadership styles and leadership culture. And for us, that became the defining moment. That was when we kind of said, all right, let's shape our company to be the polar opposite to that. Let's base it on modern leadership principles, trust-based leadership, etc., with the whole underlying thought that if you create a company where people want to work, they will perform because they want to perform, not because they're being forced to perform, which I think is an essential difference. So that is where we are today. We've scaled the company up to be about 100 team members. We just broke the 100 mark this week, actually. So that was a big milestone for us. Still servicing the Scandinavian market mostly, but but being a very international workspace, because the thing about Malaga is you can basically find any language there, and that's kind of also part of the value that we do provide.
Now, this I want to dive into because this is what I love about what you guys have done with Atender. When you and I first talked, I think it was probably at the start of this year. First of all, I was insanely jealous because in Montreal it was probably about -25, and hearing discussions about Malaga, just I started to get not stars in my eyes, but the sun in my eyes. And as you described what you'd been able to put together, as you described this jigsaw puzzle that you had been putting the pieces into, you were able to source the requisite language skills needed to be able to service individuals in the Nordic markets. Now, Andreas, you and I both know that the Nordic languages are among the most challenging in the world to service. I mean, it's really difficult. You're looking for pockets across Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. If you're lucky, you might get a dozen here and there. Can you talk a little bit about what the typical agent profile that you were able to try and source in Malaga might have looked like, just in terms of the individuals who would be able to provide these linguistic skills for this very niche language market?
Yeah, I definitely. So the Nordic markets in particular, and we work like with all European languages, but the Nordics being the largest one. But what's peculiar about the Nordic languages is that, first of all, it's a language spoken by very few people, right? So that's number one. And having that native understanding of that language is in itself difficult to find people. But there's also a massive cultural understanding of the Nordics, which is important if you want to service that market in a good way, which is a barrier for anyone who's not a native speaker or who have experienced that culture per se. So what we found in Malaga, and one of the main reasons that we have established our company there and grown the vast majority of our company in the Malaga region is quite simply that it's one of those pockets in Europe where there is a lot of Nordic native speakers available, both in the sense that you have people who've permanently moved away from the dark and misery of the north to a better climate, to a better, just out of health reasons or just wanting to live in a warmer climate. And then the other thing that we're able to build on is we're able to recruit people from the Nordic markets to Malaga, for having a 1 or 2 year chapter in your life being in that region. And so we tend to have a mix. About 50% of our employees are permanently living in the region, but the other 50% are people who relocate to stay for a stint, for a chapter in their life. And the profile of the candidates is they're native speakers, but other than that, it's such a diverse group of people. It can be anyone who's fairly young, straight out of school can be one candidate, but it tends to be people who have, a bachelor or master's degree, or, can have, 10 or 15 or 20 years work experience. We tend to get candidates that, are broad and diverse in background.
Let's talk a little bit about the operating environment in Malaga, because I can imagine one of the things that I've picked up on as I've worked as an analyst in BPO has been that when an outsourcing operation is set up in a destination where there's a heavy amount of travel and tourism activity, it can be a bit competitive. You are dealing with a lot of pressures. People are tempted to go work in hotels and restaurants. They get to interact one-on-one live in person with travelers. They get the opportunity for tips and cash. How have you found the competitive environment for labor and for some of these individuals with these amazing CX skills that might be coming down that marry up with the language skills that you're looking for?
Yeah, so for us, like that industry, the tourist industry, is actually not I don't view that as competition when it comes to the labor force that we bring in, and because that is more for the locals and more for the local Spanish people. They tend to be the ones servicing the tourism industry and restaurants, etc. Where we see competition is there is similar companies like ourselves who see the value of being located in Malaga, and I can guarantee you that most of my employees will be outreach from other companies on at least on a monthly basis, if not more often, by recruiters, by different companies that want to poach great staff from us. So for us, and I think that's also part of the reason why we've had to maintain such a focus on creating a unique workplace. Is that is what's required to be stable, to be the one who attracts talent rather than loses talent to others. One of the other interesting things, which is actually, it can be a bit of a headache being in a destination like Malaga, is that with a city like that, which is so tourist based, finding housing for people, not that we do that, but for our team members to find housing can be difficult, because it's packed during summer, really difficult to find long-term housing. And in the wintertime, it's much slower. So that is actually one of the headaches that we find being in such a heavily traveled area. Housing can be a bit of a challenge for people joining us.
It's really interesting you bring up the housing issue. I remember when I was working in Dublin, this is like literally going back 20 plus years ago, and it was the height of the Celtic Tiger. And there were a lot of different multilingual contact centers that were operating in the Dublin area. Now, admittedly, Ireland probably didn't have the greatest multilingual skills amongst Irish graduates at that point. So there was a huge amount of activity bringing people in from continental Europe with language skills. And the big issue that the contact centers were having back in the day around 2000, 2001 was when you brought people in, where could you house them that was going to be quality, but at the same time affordable? It can be a real quandary in that sense, and it's something that I think a lot of people don't anticipate. But one thing that you did bring up at the start of the chat that I think is worth exploring, and I'll put some context around this, is culture and the extent to which Atender really prioritizes that. I was speaking very recently in Manchester at an event that the CCMA in the UK put on, and one of the things that struck me amongst the enterprise buyers that were taking part was the extent to which they were looking to prioritize company culture, BPO culture, when they're going out to establish a partnership. Can you talk a little bit about the culture that you have been able to impart within the Atender framework and the organization? What makes the culture special to the point where you have such low, if any, attrition?
Yeah, that's a great question. All right, so let me start actually by giving a quick view on the whole BPO industry and where we're heading, because I like to make complex things simple if that's possible. And I think that if you look at our BPO industry as a whole, there's one massive change coming, coming and impacting us all, which is the AI wave that will just hit us. And I think that in a certain sense, that's actually just extending the self-help options that end users have. But how that impacts us is where I see it. There will still be the need for agents, but what you will do is you will remove a lot of the very simple end user support. The basic stuff will just be gone. That will just disappear. And what you're left with is actually serving the more advanced customer support, providing a better service for those who actually reach out to people. And what we find is that if you're going to be a strong player in that field, you need to be able to attract the best talent. So if you're going to attract the best talent in our space, it is a very competitive one. Then you have to be able to provide a culture, a work environment, a company that people believe in. And what we've done and for us, it was so simple. It just follows naturally. It aligns with my values on my basic beliefs on human value and how I want to treat people and how I want to grow an organization. But for us, it was how do we base a company that CX is the most measured industry in the world? Like, you have data for everything. And how do you make sure that that's not how you define people, right? It's important data, but how do you make sure that you build a culture where people thrive, not because they're defined by what their average handling time is, and for us, we just set at the core that we're going to define employee satisfaction as our main KPI, and that's going to be our main data set, and then we build on top of that with the assumption that if people are really happy, if they're motivated, they're going to be better. First of all, they're going to have a better life, but they will also be better employees for us in the long run. So we've measured employee satisfaction anonymously across the company both across the company and on a team level once a week for over 4.5 years now. So we have, data that goes back to a couple of months after we started. And the really interesting thing is I now have so much data that I can actually align the highest performing teams with correlates with the highest employee satisfaction. And that's a really interesting find, because that builds on our hypotheses, that if we create that type of workplace, people will perform as a result of it. And that's what we're actually seeing now. The highest performing teams are the ones that have the highest employee satisfaction.
Well, that's amazing validation, I think, for building a company culture. A good structural foundation around culture is so important. And, Andreas, it's interesting because one of the things that keeps coming up in my research is there's so many different outsourcers that claim to have a warm culture, a culture of positivity and atmosphere, but it really comes down to rhetoric on a website. I think that the enterprises going forward, at least what I've been picking up in the scope of the discussions I've been having, that the buyers are really going to start asking hard questions to the outsourcers about not just, can you talk about your culture from a marketing perspective? What examples can you give? What exactly are you doing? How is company culture being prioritized? And they want to see some concrete elements in terms of that culture plan or that blueprint. So congratulations to yourself and to the entire team at Atender. It sounds like you're just doing some amazing stuff. Now, for the listeners of the CX Files, if anybody wants to find out more about Atender, where can they go? Where can they find out ample information, as we would say in French?
Yeah, definitely the website would of course be a starting point. So atender.com is our website. And then, of course, we're also present on social media, etc., where you can get especially on Instagram, we have fairly a good insight in what the company culture is on a day-to-day basis, because that actually shows kind of the how the team is and the social bit of it. But the social media, our website, then you'll get a good insight of who we are.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Andreas. It's great to catch up as always. And we look forward to hearing more about the amazing success and growth of Atender going forward.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.